It's been quite some time since our last Bleach character analysis video where we took a look at the ancient, all-powerful head captain of the Gotei 13, Shigekuni Genryusai Yamamoto, leader of the Old Guard and a bastion of the most staunchly traditional and in many ways old-fashioned values of the Soul Society. To follow with, I asked you which of Bleach's coldest characters you'd like to see the next video tackle, and Captain Toshiro Hitsugaya of the 10th Division was able to outshine even Rukia Kuchiki herself. Which honestly works out fine for me, as I literally just uploaded a video going in-depth into the 13th Division. And in many ways, perhaps better than I could have even planned, Hitsugaya is the perfect character to follow up Yamamoto with, as he's both the inverse of the former head captain as well as a reflection in many ways. Where Yamamoto was the eternal standard bearer of Soul Society history, Toshiro feels like a projection of the more progressive future of the Gotei. Yamamoto wields the most powerful fire-type zanpakuto, while Hitsugaya commands the snow and ice. They both represent polar opposite sides of what it means to be both a Shinigami and a captain, while also sharing those common values of protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Hitsugaya may not be the captain commander right now, and probably wouldn't be next or even third in line either, but it feels like a guarantee one day. So in this video we're going to take a look at Bleach's one-time most popular character ever, the icy captain of the 10th Division, Toshiro Hitsugaya. But before we get started on the video, guys, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now for more Bleach content like this every single week. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up as well to help support me and the channel. And if you want to take that support for me another step further, I do also have a Patreon as well. And as always, I want to give a massive shout out and just say a huge thank you to each and every one of you supporting me over there on Patreon. I really do appreciate it. And one last piece of housekeeping: as with all of our character analysis videos, there will be spoilers in here for the entirety of the 1000-year Blood War arc to come. So to begin with, who is Toshiro Hitsugaya? Well, as I mentioned in the introduction, he was at one point the single most popular Bleach character of all time, at least in Japan anyway, topping a popularity poll during the absolute series heyday towards the end of the Arrancar Arc. And I think there are a couple of reasons for this enduring popularity. While I'm not entirely sure Hitsugaya rounded out the series quite that popular, he's still absolutely up there. And like I said, there are a few reasons for this. The first reasons are the more superficial reasons. Hitsugaya kind of embodies that, no pun intended, cool character. He seems disinterested, aloof, but he's protective of those he cares about. He has a great design that really embodies everything he is, who he is inside as well. And to top it all off, he has an amazing power set, one of the best zanpakuto in the series in terms of its ability, but also how it's depicted as well. Absolutely up there as one of my favourites, Hyourinmaru. And of course, to bolster all of that, Hitsugaya plays a pretty massive role in the series. And as far as Shinigami captains go, something else that probably helped propel him to the forefront of Bleach popularity, don't forget that the Gotei 13 is first and foremost a military organisation. While it might house all of these colourful, unique, and even sometimes wacky characters, at the end of the day they do remain somewhat detached from our main group of heroes, our human group of heroes. The Soul Society is kind of above all of that, and while of course they do ally themselves with Ichigo, they are still at the end of the day a very separate entity from him. The Gotei 13 is in and of itself its own fighting force, and they kind of feel like that in a sense. Like as much as we might come to love these characters, they do often feel in many ways very far removed from that close-knit gang of human heroes at the very centre, at the beating heart of Bleach's story. Of the captains, Hitsugaya is probably the one to come closest to that, as Kubo gives him a massive role in the Arrancar Arc. He really puts Hitsugaya into the spotlight, as it were, and allows him to be humanised in a way that many of the other captains simply aren't. In fact, speaking of humanising the Shinigami characters, speaking of giving them that beating heart, I once described, during my 10th Division overview video, I described the 10th Division as being the pure beating heart of the Gotei 13, and I think Hitsugaya really embodies that very well. And what I mean by that is that they are perhaps the most purely good division of the lot of them. They feel like the ones who are the most incorruptible, and like I said, Hitsugaya is the shining beacon at the center of that. Not only is he the youngest captain of them all, but at the start of the Soul Society arc, presumably he has been a captain for the least amount of time out of the rest of them. That's perhaps contested by other characters like Komamura and Zaraki, though it's no coincidence that those are also characters that are often seen to be extremely pure in their worldview. The Soul Society is a morally grey, dubious organisation at best, and therefore it hasn't quite had the time to sink its teeth into Hitsugaya just yet, so he does still have this very fresh, very innocent and honest worldview about him, which I think again endears him to audiences. But because he upholds this role of being the captain of this most purely good division of the 13 of them, he also carries a burden of expectation with him as well. He is pure of heart in many ways, therefore he is meant to be incorruptible, and when, for example, Aizen does succeed in corrupting him, even if it is momentarily, if Aizen manages to prey on Hitsugaya's weaknesses, on his emotions, and it causes him to lose grip on himself, causes him to lose stability, the consequences are dire in those situations. And often I can't help but think that's why Kubo really hits Hitsugaya hard in the Arrancar arc a lot of the time, where it comes to those emotional stakes, because he has real friends and family, real things to lose. That's why those consequences are so dire for him, because at least in Kubo's eyes, Hitsugaya is supposed to be better than that, and I really appreciate that. I actually like seeing the organic growth of Hitsugaya throughout the series, how he is very immature to begin with, despite of course being wise beyond his years. You do still get that sense that he is immature, that there are still enemies who can easily get under his skin, rankle him, really make him angry, really make him give in to that anger that is inside of him as well. I think that's why Kubo chooses to punish Hitsugaya so much in the Arrancar arc. It's a real learning ground for him, and he comes out of it the other side a more mature and well-rounded character, who's even more ready, I think, to take on the responsibilities that come with being a captain. And so really, that is who Toshiro Hitsugaya is. He offers us a glimpse into the Soul Society that isn't really laced with corruption or a moral greyness that seems inherent to a lot of the divisions, specifically those who have had captains who have been around for quite some time. It's this general naivety, but this general kindness that emanates from Hitsugaya that goes along with his incredible power set, his prodigal skills, the fact that he is incredibly strong as well, that I think makes him such a well-rounded and beloved character among the community. Of course, there is a flip side to this as well, I would argue, as if to play up to the fact that Hitsugaya was so popular. He often got an awful lot of exposure, particularly in the Arrancar arc, sometimes at the expense of characters who may have deserved it more in those different circumstances, and I think that drew some ire from fans, particularly over in the West, where Hitsugaya wasn't quite so popular. But at the end of the day, I think Kubo does a decent job of balancing out Hitsugaya's overall screen time, the impact he has on the story, and just how much spotlight he does actually receive. But there is no denying that he is absolutely one of the captains we see the most throughout the series. And again, I think there's a great reason for that. Hitsugaya is so popular and so synonymous with Bleach itself that I would honestly have him up there with the likes of Ichigo, Rukia, Kon, and maybe characters like Urahara as far as mascots for the series actually go. And of course, another pretty massive reason for that popularity comes from Hitsugaya's overall visual design. And as with basically all of the captains in Bleach, I genuinely don't think there is really a dud design among the captains, and that goes for every era, but particularly that initial set of captains we get in the Soul Society arc, they all look absolutely stellar, and Toshiro Hitsugaya is no exception. In fact, he is another example of Kubo being an absolute master of character design. Hitsugaya, especially when viewed next to the rest of the captains, doesn't look particularly crazy at all, but there's enough about him that he stands out easily among them. Of course, the immediate thing that draws your eye is the fact that he is a literal child when in comparison to the rest of the captains, and that of course is the main thing that makes him stand out, as well of course his shock of snow white hair. And I do think there is something almost appealingly simple about the way Hitsugaya looks. I think the fact that you know he has these icy powers, and that is really reflected on the surface with that white hair, with those sort of wide emerald crystalline eyes. I think it all comes together really, really well. His actual outfit, of course, is pretty simple, but of course he has that green sash that runs across his front with that, I think it's supposed to be like a star or an almost snowflake style brooch on the front, and of course there's his zanpakuto, which he wears on his back, which is basically the same length he is. Hitsugaya's overall visual design, while keeping its foundations intact, actually changes and evolves an awful lot throughout the story itself, throughout the different arcs, and actually changes drastically in the Soul Society arc itself, and quite quickly as well. Hitsugaya's not the only character that this can apply to. There are a few captains in the Soul Society arc where their designs are clearly amended by Kubo pretty fast. I would say Yamamoto is another one of those characters who looks pretty much totally different in his initial appearance. You know, while keeping the foundations facially, the structure of his face and all that, he looks basically totally different. And the same goes for Kenpachi Zaraki as well, I would say. His hair is, of course, while similar to how it would appear later on in the same arc, it does look quite a bit different. Hitsugaya is another one who is the same here, looking even more childish in his initial appearance than he would do later on in that very same arc. So it's really cool seeing Kubo's designs evolve like this over time, while Hitsugaya, you know, much to his chagrin, never actually grows up, really. He does look more mature as the series goes on, as the art style evolves, eventually getting to, of course, the time skip after the defeat of Aizen, where he adds a green scarf to his repertoire, which I think actually does a lot for this character design in general, and his overall hairstyle, again, much in line with the rest of the captains, becomes more quote-unquote realistic, less stylized, and again, just looks really, really good. Personally, I think Hitsugaya's post-time skip design is overall superior to his initial design. And actually, I think that's true for a lot of characters, Renji, Byakuya, Zaraki, and that says a lot for Kubo's ability to design characters, where his initial designs were already so iconic. I think that the way he evolves them to look more natural once the time skip happens is a genuine gift. The only time I'm not certain about his design is at the start of the second Quincy invasion in the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, where now to accompany his scarf, he's wearing a similar sort of garment around his head as well, which I always thought looked completely ridiculous, and Kubo eventually gets rid of it, so maybe he felt the same way. But as for Hitsugaya's personality, you might look at this character and think there isn't much depth there. Like I said, on the surface he does come across as very stern, very cold, dismissive of people, aloof, seeming like a bit of a loner, wanting to be most of the time left to his own thoughts, but there is way more to this character than that. There is a sort of playfulness to him. The fact that he is a child really bounces off well with the other characters as well. There's a desire, I think, to be wanted to be taken seriously, to prove himself among the rest of the captaincy. And I really do love that, and I like as well the fact that Kubo builds on Hitsugaya's personality as we move, especially throughout the Arrancar arc. There's that real personal triangle that Kubo forges between Hitsugaya, his childhood friend Momo, and of course the series' main villain, Aizen. And that's another reason why Hitsugaya, which we'll get into a bit later, gets more screen time than a lot of other characters in the Arrancar arc. It's not just because there's favoritism there, it's because Hitsugaya has to be at the forefront of this story, because Aizen has personal ties to Momo. That's a character he has hurt in more ways than one, both mentally and physically, and therefore that puts Hitsugaya on the line to avenge her, to want to bring down Aizen on a personal level outside of doing it just out of a sense of duty. So I mentioned at the start of this video that Hyourinmaru is a zanpakuto I really, really enjoy, and that's a good thing because we get to see it an awful lot throughout the series, but I do think it's one of Kubo's best designs, one of his best put together power sets. It's simple, easy to understand, but very, very effective, and a visual spectacle as well, which of course really helps in a visual medium. There's never going to be anything not cool about an ice dragon, and so this power comes together really, really nicely. But perhaps to go hand in hand with the amount of exposure this power set actually gets, Hyourinmaru is just a ridiculous zanpakuto overall. Now it's meant to be, of course, the most powerful ice-type zanpakuto in the world of Bleach. It even has the power to control the weather itself, but it just has an absolutely insane amount of abilities at its disposal. It seems like Kubo, particularly where his bankai Daigurin Hyourinmaru was concerned, Kubo would just invent new abilities for him depending on the scenario, depending on the situation. It's one of these things where if you deign to compare certain bankai, it really does feel unfair. If you take, for example, Komamura's Kokujo Tengen Myo, the only new thing we learnt about it prior to the 1,000-Year Blood War arc was that damaging the bankai would damage Komamura. So basically the only thing it got was an actual weakness, a nerf to a bankai that was already seen as not being that versatile, not being that great. Whereas Daigurin Hyourinmaru is concerned, it was just getting new abilities like there was no tomorrow. And it's weird because very few of them ever make reappearances again, which kind of goes to show you just how situational a lot of these powers are, just the fact that Kubo was giving him them whenever he felt he needed them. Powers like Ryu Senka, Senin, Hyoro, Hyoten, Hyakoso, Horyu Senbi, and Guncho Surara. The last one in that list is the only one to make a reappearance again. But that being said, for a power that on the surface is pretty simplistic, it does just allow Hitsugaya to control ice, and then you can go a little bit further than that as well with the whole control over moisture, control over the weather, the atmosphere, and stuff like that. I think Kubo was able to maintain a cool level of creative consistency with these powers as well that always at least made it entertaining to see. We get a decent amount of history for this character too. We get a real nice insight into kind of where he came from, him growing up, and him eventually joining the Shino Academy to become a Shinigami. We get a real sense of what makes this character who he is, where that good-natured side of Hitsugaya comes from, and he's also one of the few Shinigami, along with Ichigo, Renji, and Kyoraku. I believe they're the only ones whose zanpakuto spirits we actually get to meet in the source material itself. And that is shown off a couple of times, but originally it is during this small segment about Hitsugaya's history that we get. It's really cool. His inner world is presented as an icy field devoid of life, yet a voice kind of rumbles on the horizon like thunder. Something is coming, and I really like that imagery. And it shows at the moment that where Hitsugaya's powers are concerned, there's currently nothing there, just a barren wasteland almost, but the potential is there, and that is what is rumbling over on the horizon. We get to see in this flashback about Hitsugaya's past that he and Hinamori used to live together, and Hinamori joins the academy before he does. One thing that's cool, a small detail about this, is that Hitsugaya reveals he used to live in District 1 of the Western Rukon guy, and you can actually see how insanely close they are to the Seirete in this very chapter. So where they live is presumably pretty nice, all things considered, as far as the Rukon districts go. You can see other children playing. It looks like for the most part Hitsugaya probably had at least a fairly decent upbringing. But of course, having Momo actually grow up with him, having them be childhood friends who live together, really does hammer home that incredibly close bond that they have. And Hitsugaya shares a few of these bonds with other characters in the series. And again, I think that's great. It makes him more human, it makes him more personable, but it gives him a weakness that villains, that enemies are able to exploit as well. He wears that honor, that compassion, that love, that care on his sleeve for characters like Momo, for characters like Matsumoto, and they suffer as a result of that. And I think that's a really kind of just compelling character trait for Kubo to pick out and pull on. And it does make Hitsugaya more relatable, I think, to the average reader. But we even get a little time skip during this flashback. We find out that Momo has been at the academy a full 5 years before Hitsugaya even considers joining himself. And it's actually quite a sad story, and Kubo's art here is fantastic, really showing how Hitsugaya has grown ever so slightly in that 5 years, maybe not in terms of his actual height, but his face has grown a little more mature from that very childlike appearance it has at the start of the flashback. But on the flip side, his grandmother has become so incredibly frail and ill-looking over the last few years. Although they do mention it a little bit, they do draw attention to that fact. Kubo does a great job here of showing and not telling, I think, of really just showing us the situation that Hitsugaya and his grandmother are currently living in. For example, every time his grandmother looks to bring up the fact that presumably she wants Hitsugaya to leave her side, to feel like he doesn't need to be tethered to her, she won't be lonely without him, and he's free to go to the academy, to pursue these powers, to pursue this voice that he keeps hearing inside his head, that he's been hearing for the last 5 years, but he's been putting it off for his grandmother's sake. Every time she looks like she wants to bring that up, he quickly changes the subject and leaves to do something else. It's kind of interesting that Hitsugaya meets Rangiku in a Rukongai shop. That feels a little bit random. You wouldn't think there was too much of a reason for her to visit there, but obviously Kubo needed to bring them together somehow. But of course, as Hyourinmaru presumably grows more and more impatient, it's been 5 years now by that point, his voice is no longer something rumbling on the horizon. It's no longer a clap of thunder within the clouds. It's now right here in front of Hitsugaya, no longer willing to be ignored. Hyourinmaru himself, this massive icy dragon with these enormous wings, appears before him, kind of roaring at him, bellowing at him, telling him, you know, are you my master? Can you hear my name? Although Hitsugaya can't hear what he's saying quite properly. But, you know, the time is now. Hyourinmaru is upon him at this point. I think that's a really cool way of visualizing how a Shinigami's latent powers, or, you know, how a soul who it can easily become a Shinigami's latent powers will slowly overpower them and awaken over time. At the very end of this flashback, there's a really good shot of Hitsugaya finally in a Shihakusho at the end, wandering, stepping out onto that icy, barren field, presumably about to face down Hyourinmaru properly and learn its name. But it is cool because, like I said, it shows you that Shinigami, especially ones with truly powerful latent abilities, will be drawn to this destiny in the end, no matter what. Hitsugaya has no real choice but to take that leap. And it's a really nice moment where Matsumoto returns to their homestead and kind of says to him, like, you know, you have no choice. You're killing your grandmother because your spiritual pressure, your rare yoku is just leaking off you all the time, and she's being frozen to death simply by being around you. Join the academy, you know, you should come with me, you should become a Shinigami, and there's just a really nice moment between those two where that bond is built for the first time as well. There's also another nice piece of history for Hitsugaya that lends us even more introspection into this character, who's already quite introspective as far as Bleach characters go. But that's, of course, when Matsumoto wants to try and celebrate his birthday. Hitsugaya, you know, rebukes this, you know, people from Rukongai don't have birthdays, but Matsumoto kind of wants to just create one for him anyway, which again gives him a nice link to Gin Ichimaru, though he doesn't know it, I don't think, but Gin gave Matsumoto a birthday once, and Matsumoto is now passing this on to Hitsugaya, that feeling of belonging, of knowing that someone out there cares for you. It's a really nice moment, to be fair. She organises some fireworks for Hitsugaya. They all meet on a rooftop. Hitsugaya, Hinamori, Aizen, and Matsumoto. Aizen being there is great. And this chapter occurs as well just before. Kubo knows exactly what he's doing. It occurs just before Aizen is revealed to be alive all this time, and of course a villain. But it gives us a bit of introspection to Hitsugaya. He believes that, you know, people are like fireworks. They rise and they rise and they eventually explode into this like litany, this blossom of colours before falling and scattering once more. Lovely bit of poetry from Kubo. It's a great bit of character work here, and Hitsugaya is once again given a chance to open up to the audience, even if he doesn't open up to anyone else around him, really. And one thing as well, before we move into Hitsugaya's role in Bleach, is the kind of juxtaposition between him and another character who is also very similar to Hitsugaya in many ways, but went down a decidedly different and darker path, that being, of course, Gin Ichimaru. They've both got white hair, they're both prodigies, they're both extraordinarily skilled Shinigami, they both have some kind of a extremely close bond with Rangiku Matsumoto. The differences, of course, come in how they were raised, the original circumstances they found themselves in. Hitsugaya had a family in the Rukon district, and he lived very close to the Seirete. They had it pretty easy, all things considered. He had a grandmother to look after him. He had Momo, although he kind of mocks her. He calls her Momo bedwetter and all that sort of thing. It's sibling rivalry. You know, they're messing around with each other, and it was a nice, warm house to grow up in. And then he meets Matsumoto, and that begins a path for him. Whereas Gin Ichimaru also comes from the Rukon district, but presumably considerably further out in the sticks, where things are a little more dog-eat-dog. That's where he actually meets Matsumoto. Those two form their bond, but Gin has nothing but her, and so he's willing to go to extreme lengths to avenge the horrible thing that happened to her and happened to them out and about. So it kind of feels like Hitsugaya and Gin were on a very similar path, but ended up diverging because of where they came from in the world. And that one link they have is their relationship to Matsumoto, which in turn has done different things for them. And I think especially when you look at it like that, Gin becomes an even more tragic character than he already was, but it's just really cool to see that these two characters end up on a collision course when it comes to the Soul Society arc. And speaking of the Soul Society arc, let's have a look at Toshiro Hitsugaya's role in Bleach. Like I said, it is pretty extensive overall. Certainly as far as the captains go, Hitsugaya has one of the biggest roles of the lot of them. Now, Toshiro Hitsugaya has a pretty extensive manga lifespan, first appearing in chapter 81, to be fair, like an awful lot of the other captains in this first major arc, and of course lasting all the way until the Hell chapter that we got, what was it, 2 years ago now? So Hitsugaya is basically with us for the entirety of Bleach. And yet, immediately off the bat, when it comes to the Soul Society arc, Hitsugaya plays, honestly, a pretty interesting role in this arc. I would say he is relegated entirely to the subplot of the growing conspiracy at play behind the scenes, but actually relegation makes it sound like a bad thing. But instead, Hitsugaya plays an active role in trying to uncover what's actually going on behind the circumstances surrounding Rukia's execution. The main plot, the A-plot of the Soul Society arc is of course Ichigo and his friends breaking into Soul Society, taking down the captains on the way, and trying to rescue Rukia, trying to save her from her impending doom, but something else is absolutely happening behind the curtain at the same time. Somebody has killed Aizen, a conspiracy is unfolding, Gin Ichimaru appears to be very, very suspicious, and Hitsugaya is kind of leading the forefront into that investigation, which I think puts him in a really interesting light in this first major story arc. And this is of course all kicked off in Hitsugaya's first appearance. During this appearance, the initial captains meeting, he complains about the other captains having a go at each other, calling them all old men, saying that they're all bickering as usual. But he overhears, of course, the scripted conversation between Aizen and Gin, which sets him on a path, the wrong path, admittedly. He begins to suspect Gin and Gin alone of foul play. But it's interesting because it does put Hitsugaya on this collision course, not only with Gin and eventually with Aizen, but also with his friend Hyourinmaru Momo, which is of course what Aizen is planning all along. But Hitsugaya warns Hyourinmaru to be suspicious of the 3rd Division, and once Aizen is found dead, Hyourinmaru takes that warning to heart and believes Gin to be the one who killed him. But Hitsugaya is forced to reprimand her as she tries to attack not only Gin, but his vice-captain Izuru Kira out in the open in the middle of the Seirete itself, forcing Momo to be imprisoned. But Hitsugaya suspects that she was taunted, that she was provoked into this by Gin himself. What's really intriguing about this scene is that it is implied, heavily implied, that Gin would have made a move to kill Hyourinmaru if she had gotten close enough to him. You know, you kind of see his finger twitch as he was about to do something to her. Hitsugaya even openly confronts him and says, you know, you were about to kill Hyourinmaru there. How would that have gone down? If Gin had just killed Hyourinmaru in front of these other characters, these other vice-captains, these other officers in the middle of the Seirete, can't imagine that would have gone over too well. But regardless, Hitsugaya threatens Gin and says, you know, if you ever make her bleed, I will kill you myself. And eventually, he confronts him over all of this, over everything that's going on, speculating Gin to not only be behind Rukia's execution, but maybe even plotting to use the power of the Sokyoku itself to perhaps even go as far as destroy the Soul Society. But of course, Hyourinmaru arrives having been so warped at this point by Aizen's machinations, his lies, by Gin's acting, by everything that's going on, that she now believes Hitsugaya to be the one who killed Aizen. She attacks him. It's an emotional moment where Hitsugaya is forced to smack her away. He has no other choice, and she's instantly knocked out, leading, of course, to his duel between himself and Gin, which is a really... I remember thinking this was so awesome back in the day, mostly because Gin was my original favourite character of Bleach, so finally getting to see him fight back then was so great. But of course, getting to the point where you get these two, like I said, these two prodigies, they've got so much in common, so many similarities, but they are on totally different moral pathways. But it is cool seeing these two characters come to a head, Hitsugaya managing to get one up on Gin, freezing his arm, only for Gin to open his eyes. Again, that was such an awesome moment. And blast Shinzo straight towards Hitsugaya's face, only for Matsumoto to arrive to block it to protect Hyourinmaru. And this is where these emotional threads are pulled, they all come together in one big confrontation, which works really well. But eventually Hitsugaya fully resolves to put a stop to this execution and heads to Central 46 himself. And because Hitsugaya is the captain who has been at the forefront of this conspiracy theory subplot so far, he is the one who basically kickstarts the end game of the Soul Society arc, discovering upon his investigation that all of the Central 46 members are dead and have been for some time. He eventually discovers that Aizen is in fact still alive and has almost killed Hyourinmaru. This isn't the first instance of Hitsugaya's youth kind of getting the better of him and him allowing his anger to overtake him, but it is the first time it happens with Aizen, which would of course start Hitsugaya feeling this personal need outside of the duty of a captain to bring Aizen to justice for Hyourinmaru's sake. But Hitsugaya activates his bankai, you get this amazing double-page spread of Daiguren Hyourinmaru as he lunges for Aizen, only to be taken down immediately. As Hitsugaya is kind of lying there dying, of course, eventually Unohana arrives and begins to try and heal him, to try and save his and Hyourinmaru's life. She's successful, though Hyourinmaru is left in an incredibly bad state as Hitsugaya kind of looks over her at the end of the arc. It's a solemn moment, and it kind of puts Hitsugaya onto the path that he would be on in the Arrancar arc, which would eventually lead to disaster. When it comes to the Arrancar arc, Hitsugaya gets a lot more to do here than most other captains, as he is involved in this arc from the very earliest stages. While the vast majority of the Gotei 13's upper echelon remains in the Soul Society, Hitsugaya is sent to Karakura Town as the leader of his own advance unit to basically deal with and see off any potential Arrancar invasions, incursions, any attacks that might happen in the early stages of the battle. And so Hitsugaya and the rest of his team, made up of Rukia, Renji, Matsumoto, Ikaku, and Yumichika, arrive at Ichigo's school. They're all dressed as school kids, they've all got the uniforms on. And it's a nice moment. It's again a very humanizing moment for these characters to get them involved on the ground level like this, have them even meeting some of Ichigo's friends. To be honest, when you look at the bigger picture, is there really a need for this at all? Did these characters need to be brought into Ichigo's school like this? Is it ever really brought up again? They probably didn't. But it's a very fun moment. It's a great opportunity to see these characters in a totally different light. And it worked really, really well, I think, to kind of flip our expectations on their head. This is really the first time we're seeing a lot of these characters outside of the Soul Society arc, where they were the enemies for the most part. Enemies in quotation marks, but then you suddenly get to see them in this new setting, in this new environment, and it works really well to change how we thought we were feeling about them till this point. But Arrancar enemies do show up. Grimjo's group arrive. Hitsugaya takes on Xiaolong Kufong, who is honestly pretty cool, I think. Xiaolong overpowers Hitsugaya even in Bankai until the Soul Society approves the lifting of Gentei Kaijo, basically allowing the Shinigami to fight at full power, as opposed to, I think, 20% power or something like that. And when his full power is released, he manages to kill Xiaolong in a single hit with Ryu Senka. Honestly, it's a pretty decent battle. Hitsugaya is really pushed to the brink before finally being able to use Gentei Kaijo. And honestly, I think Gentei Kaijo is a nice way for them to win a fight. I think it actually makes a lot of sense, because it does make a lot of sense that the Shinigami would have caps placed on their power as a sort of regulation of the Soul Society when they step foot into the human world. But Hitsugaya then reports back to Yamamoto, who reveals Aizen's motive. Here we get to see some of the Shinigami even wearing human clothes, which again I think does a lot to endear them to the readers, taking them out of their uniforms, placing them in a real world setting, making them look as human as possible, removes that separation between human and Shinigami, and I think it does a really good job of that. He then gets a chance to speak briefly to Hyourinmaru, who is slowly returning to her old self, but she does kind of slip and fall back and cracks a bit and enters another sort of manic episode where she thinks that Aizen can't possibly be evil. She starts to lose herself. It's a sad moment. Hitsugaya is once again faced with the results of Aizen's evil, with his twisted ways, with his malicious manipulation of Hyourinmaru. She is absolutely a victim in this, and Hitsugaya, I think, again, because of the way they grew up together, feels like he's her defender. In some ways she is his responsibility, and he absolutely feels a need, I think, to take down Aizen. And I think Kubo does a decent job. He maybe could have played up a little bit more, but he does a decent job of kind of threading this needle, this idea that Hitsugaya is feeling a growing responsibility to bring down Aizen himself because of what he's done to Hinamori. But when Karakura is attacked again, Hitsugaya takes on this Sparda number 10, Yami, before Luffy takes over the fight, and Hitsugaya tries to attack him before he can release his zanpakuto, but Luffy takes him out. However, Luffy doesn't bother to finish him off or even check on him, allowing Hitsugaya the time he needs to use the ability Senen Hyoro, imprisoning Luffy in this kind of icy cage. However, Luffy survives and escapes, and once Orihime is taken to Wako Mundo by the Arrancar, Hitsugaya and his team speak with Yamamoto before being ordered to return to the Soul Society. And then when it comes to the fake Karakura Town arc, Hitsugaya arrives with the rest of the captains and vice captains to do battle with Aizen and the top 3 Espada, challenging the 3rd Espada tier Harribel. You know my opinion on this fight by now. I think it's a pretty naff battle overall. It just kind of goes back and forwards, but there's a real feeling of lethargy between both of these combatants until Hitsugaya finally decides, okay, it's been long enough now, I can use my ultimate ability, and he just defeats her like that. Also, considering Harribel is the 3rd Espada, her screen time is extraordinarily limited. This is a very, very short fight when you kind of take all of the sections of this battle from the chapters that it's cut up in, put it all together, there really isn't a lot here. But he duels Harribel, feels a little bit of concern when Hinamori shows up on the battlefield. Again, that's a nice little addition to this through line, this small subplot about how Hitsugaya feels in regards to Hinamori, how he feels in regards to Aizen, showing us exactly how much damage Aizen has actually done. To anyone out there who says, oh, you know, Aizen's not really a villain, he's not a bad guy, you know, he's doing things because he doesn't agree with the state of the world, he just wants to change the way things work, I would absolutely direct you to this subplot that permeates the entirety of the Arrancar arc that really shows how Hitsugaya cares so deeply for Momo and has to confront what Aizen has done to her pretty much every time he sees her, from that moment at the end of the Soul Society arc to basically the very end of the fake Karakura Town battle. It shows you how much Aizen is messing with both of them, really just for the hell of it. But anyway, after Harribel's fraction fall, she ups the ante, viciously attacking Hitsugaya before revealing that she is the 3rd Espada. He activates Bankai, she attacks him and sends him flying before activating her release form. Hitsugaya seems to be killed instantly, only to reveal that it was an icy clone, again showing that Kubo basically just gives Hitsugaya new Bankai abilities whenever he feels he needs them before they continue battling. This is the part of the fight that, like I said, is just not that interesting to me. It kind of just goes backwards and forwards. They both talk about the lore of battle, before Hitsugaya finally activates Hyoten Hyakoso and uses the moisture that is just covering the battlefield thanks to their back and forth, thanks to Harribel splashing water everywhere before he traps Harribel in a tower of ice flowers. This is probably one of the most visually stunning abilities in the entire series, to be fair. I think it's very, very cool. Unfortunately, however, for Hitsugaya, it is basically totally ineffective. But when Wonder Weiss frees Harribel from her icy prison and she attacks Hitsugaya again, the Vizards Hiyori and Lisa arrive to help. And Hitsugaya, again, being this very pure, this very non-judgmental person, someone who you can totally imagine would quite easily accept the Vizards as his allies, would feel no real prejudice towards them, agrees with Komamura's statement that they are going to fight alongside them, even if they don't really know who they are, and even if they might appear a little strange on the outside with their hollow masks, it doesn't matter to certain captains more than others. Though he does manage to have a brief argument with Hiyori regarding how tall either one of them actually is. But they all come together to attack Harribel, but she's quickly cut down by Aizen. And once Ichigo arrives and we enter the kind of final stage of this battle, Hitsugaya joins up with the others in order to defend him, launching the first attack on Aizen himself. And again, that through line, that subplot of Hitsugaya feeling the need to fight for Hinamori's honor, to fight for her, is upped immensely here as it reaches boiling point towards the end of this battle, but Aizen is totally toying with Hitsugaya to begin with. You get to the stage where Kubo is really showing us this in almost every chapter of this fight. Hitsugaya is the first one to launch an attack on Aizen, even though he seems to be keeping his cool for the most part. But then Hitsugaya and Aizen have a really great conversation on what it means to be a captain, how Hitsugaya claims that Aizen was never captain material because he used to hold hate in his heart, he used to swing his sword out of hate rather than duty, but Aizen turns that back on him, saying, are you really telling me that there's no hate in that sword you're swinging? Of all the captains here, you have the most reason to hate me. Or did all of that hatred of yours magically disappear the moment Hyourinmaru showed up here without a scratch? And of course, that sends Hitsugaya over the edge. He kind of rages at Aizen, saying, you know, are you saying that I'm not worthy of being a captain because I'm holding hatred in my heart? If that's the case, you're absolutely right. I am more than happy to discard my captain status if it means being able to kill you. I won't show you any mercy. As he just seethes with anger, he activates bankai. A small smirk crinkles Aizen's face as even Kyoraku kind of comes in and he's like, you need to settle down, Captain Hitsugaya. That's a great moment that, of course, is leading. It's a harbinger of absolute doom that will eventually befall Toshiro and the other captains in his vicinity. And I love all of this. I think you could call this section the fall of Toshiro Hitsugaya, as you see that Kubo has used Aizen to successfully corrupt the incorruptible. That pure heart of the Gotei found in the 10th division has now been stained. And so Hitsugaya continues to battle Aizen as other captains fall around them until it finally seems like everything has gone Hitsugaya's way and they have managed to defeat him. They've managed to come together, utilize their teamwork, and defeat the series' main villain. Hitsugaya freezes Aizen's arm, and then, because Aizen realizes everything is backwards thanks to Shinji Sakanade, Hitsugaya is able to impale him through the back, seemingly killing him once and for all, and putting an end to Hitsugaya and Hyourinmaru's personal demon. Except, of course, it's all an illusion. Aizen has one last trick up his sleeve, and it is perhaps his cruelest of them all, although I did also say this is Aizen's best moment in the series. Aizen reveals that he wasn't there at all, and in fact Hitsugaya has impaled none other than Hyourinmaru through the back. Not only did Hitsugaya dedicate himself to fighting for Hyourinmaru, to fighting on her behalf, to do what a captain is supposed to do and fight for those who cannot fight for themselves, Aizen corrupted that ideal, and in the end ultimately turned it against Hitsugaya to make him commit the ultimate sin he feels he possibly could, turning his sword against Hyourinmaru. It hurt Hitsugaya to hit Hyourinmaru in the Soul Society arc when he had absolutely no choice, but here he has stabbed her with the intent to kill, and Aizen has used that to his advantage. And as Hitsugaya kind of cradles Hyourinmaru and she asks him, why did you do that? Why would you stab me? Using her, childhood name for him, he just loses it. He screams. He has basically a full-on breakdown, just roaring this animalistic, terrible yell as he just lunges for Aizen, again, tossing aside all pretense of wanting to fight him as a captain, tossing aside everything, all strategy, all care, lunging for Aizen, wanting to just tear him to shreds, but of course that's the opening Aizen has been waiting for. The other captains scramble around Hitsugaya to try and prevent him from throwing everything away, but of course it's too little too late. Aizen utilizes that moment to bring them all down, slicing off Hitsugaya's arm and his leg as he sends him spiraling to the city below, but promising to leave him alive so he can witness what happens next. So it's a brutal, humbling defeat for Hitsugaya, and honestly a cruel end, a bitter end to that subplot. Hitsugaya was not strong enough to fight for Hyourinmaru after all. It seems he has a long way yet to go. But of course it's just another notch on Hitsugaya's journey of growth that we get to see, that we get to experience with him throughout the series. Once the battle with Aizen is over, Matsumoto watches as Hitsugaya trains with his bankai in a cave, desperate to master it if he's ever going to become worthy of being able to protect Hyourinmaru. When it comes to the Lost Agent arc, of course, as always, the Gotei 13 are barely seen in this story arc, but once Ichigo's powers are restored to him, Hitsugaya is one of the Shinigami that arrive in Karakura town to help fight Execution. Now, all of the Shinigami here have some kind of personal relationship to Ichigo, really barring Hitsugaya. If I'm totally honest, it does feel like Hitsugaya is just here because he's a fan favourite, but he tells Ichigo that getting his powers back is a result of the changes he imposed on Soul Society and Yamamoto himself. Really basically saying to Ichigo, you changed the Soul Society to the point where it's willing to bend and break the rules for you, to reward you, to thank you for everything you have done for us, and I do love this moment in general. Hitsugaya then goes on to explain to Ichigo about Ginjo and his origin, and once the other members of Execution arrive, Yukio tries to kill Ikkaku, but Hitsugaya saves him. Yukio matches everyone up into individual rooms, with Hitsugaya taking on Yukio himself. Hitsugaya eventually makes it to Yukio's control room as Yukio tries to summon monsters to battle him, but Hitsugaya dodges them easily, pushes Yukio onto a patch of ice, and freezes his body. I like the way this fight ends so casually. A lot of these execution fights do feel a bit like that, but Hitsugaya actually uses strategy to win this battle in a way we've never really seen before. I like that you actually get to see him draw a path of ice on the floor beforehand, and then eventually just simply push Yukio onto it. Really, when he is able to be so calm and so collected, a fight like this is absolute child's play for him. But Hitsugaya eventually saves Yukio from his own monsters and forces him outside, demanding that he shut off the final chat room before it's destroyed by Ichigo's bankai. Hitsugaya, along with the other Shinigami that came to the real world, watch as Ichigo takes on Ginjo, explaining that the Soul Society were watching Ichigo all this time, basically ready to make a move in case he decided that, no, the Soul Society are his enemies and he will in fact take up Ginjo on his offer and join Ginjo in trying to bring them down. But seeing the way things turned out, Hitsugaya is of course glad that Ichigo was the one to follow in Ginjo's footsteps. And then later he's present when Ichigo returns to the Soul Society. And then of course we get to the 1,000-year Blood War arc. Hitsugaya is present in that initial captain's meeting, and when the first invasion gets underway, he battles Sternritter Ai the Iron Kangdu, who steals his bankai after a quick clash. And Kubo again uses Hitsugaya as the focus point to show us just how damaging it is to lose a bankai, how distraught the captains actually are, what it must feel like to them to have a piece of their soul essentially ripped away as he screams to Hyourinmaru to speak to him. But after Yamamoto dies, Hitsugaya of course mourns with the other captains, and then later returns to the academy in his division's barracks to begin honing his zanjutsu skills, deciding to move on after losing his bankai, even though he worked so hard to eventually master and complete it. What's gone is gone, and he's willing to try and branch out essentially to return to the basics, to become strong enough to make up for that gaping wound that losing his bankai has left. And then when the second invasion begins, Hitsugaya defends his men from Basby, freezing his flames. He and Rangiku battle Basby before being completely overpowered, and Hitsugaya is totally dominated and destroyed by the Sternritter in a genuine display of a captain being completely just wrecked. Now Hitsugaya is part of this trinity of captains along with Byakuya and Zaraki, who are all extraordinarily powerful, extraordinarily popular, and they all kind of go through much of the same treatment in this arc. Zaraki and Byakuya are both totally wrecked and destroyed by the Sternritter in the first invasion, and now in the second invasion, it's Hitsugaya's turn to feel that kind of humbling effect. Kangdu arrives on the scene having, in my opinion, it looks like actually killed Matsumoto. I've never been quite sure exactly what's happened to her here, but the fact that he just dumps her on the floor, the fact that she has an obvious blood-stained wound around her throat, and most crucially, the fact that her eyes are wide open, does actually make me think she might be dead here. And then of course, once she's zombified, she's able to be properly resurrected later on down the line. But it's a pretty dark moment, this. Hitsugaya is lying there just totally helpless on the floor, this massive burned wound, scorched, blazed onto his entire body, and his eyes are just wide open in horror as he sees Matsumoto on the ground next to him. And there's a great bit of art here from Kubo where Hitsugaya, in this moment, looks perhaps the most childlike he ever has, when he is just so scared of what has happened to Matsumoto. He is so horrified of what's become of her. He just looks totally childlike. These massive, wide open eyes, this terrified look on his face. I think it's really, really well handled. But of course, at the last moment, Urahara is able to help Hitsugaya regain his bankai, enabling him to get the upper hand on Kangdu and freezing him thanks to his new holofied powers. But Hitsugaya collapses unconscious before he's able to get to Matsumoto, and at some point after that, he is found and zombified by Giselle, who adds him to her army. Hitsugaya isn't seen again for a while. When Mayuri battles Giselle, she summons him to be the commander of her zombie army. Hitsugaya takes out Charlotte Kulhorn, basically decimates the entirety of the opposing side, wipes out Ikkaku, wipes out Yumachika in this uncharacteristic display of brutality, which I've gone into here appear in a specific video dedicated to Hitsugaya's zombified form, before battling Mayuri himself. And although Hitsugaya again just demolishes Mayuri in a straight fight with his no mercy approach, killing him numerous times, Mayuri has afflicted him with this drug that basically resets Hitsugaya's own timeline when he reaches the point of killing Mayuri. It is kind of weird to wrap your head around, not entirely sure how it works, because it implies that Hitsugaya is the only one seeing this fight play out, or else it's somehow resetting the timeline for everybody involved. Best not to think about it, I think, although I do think the drug is actually pretty creative and quite unique, and eventually, having gone through this looping process enough times, Hitsugaya collapses to the ground, paralysed, allowing Mayuri to begin undoing the zombification process. And again, Hitsugaya is missing from action for a while, much later after Mayuri's battle against Pernida Pankajaz up in Varvelt. He reveals that he has brought Hitsugaya to the royal palace inside this kind of healing tube. Hitsugaya's zombification has been reversed at the cost of shortening his lifespan overall, but he thanks Mayuri before facing Gerard Valkyrie. Hitsugaya battles Gerard alongside Byakuya and Kenpachi. There's that trinity again, and we've done a video on this fight very recently. And Hitsugaya is, again, the kind of noble one. He's the one trying to keep Gerard and chunks of Varvelt from falling down onto the Seirete below, but eventually his bankai is completed as his ice petals disappear, and he transforms into an adult version of himself, and together, they come together to seemingly kill Gerard, although he somehow survives. But once the war is over, once the Vandenreich has been defeated and the Soul Society has mostly rebuilt 10 years later, Hitsugaya is back to normal, meeting up with Captain Tetsuzaimon Iba of the 7th Division as they all make their way to Rukia's inauguration. There's a nice bit of warmth from Hitsugaya here with a smile on his face as he says it's a great thing that Hisagi hasn't been able to use his bankai in the space of time since the battle with Yhwach, because it does mean they have successfully managed to achieve peace after all. But then of course we have the Hell chapter. Hitsugaya doesn't really do an awful lot here. He's hanging out in the 10th Division barracks with Matsumoto, listening to Mayuri's announcement before visiting Ukitake's grave with the other captains in order to prepare for the ritual, when of course he catches sight of the phosphoplasm of Hell appearing in mid-air. But that's basically it for the character of Toshiro Hitsugaya, the current captain of the 10th Division, and like I said, one of Bleach's most enduringly popular characters, and a character we really get to see a lot of and get to understand and know very well. I like Hitsugaya. He's not my favourite character, I won't make any lies about that, but I do enjoy this character and I enjoy what he brings to the table. I enjoy how different he feels from the rest of the captains, how much warmth and humanity he brings and injects into the Gotei 13, a sort of childlike innocence and hope for the future. Hitsugaya really does seem like that projection of the possible future of the Gotei 13 itself once the old guard are gone, once the older generations have died out. It does seem like Hitsugaya is exactly the sort of person that would lead the Gotei 13 to whatever the future holds for them. But that's just my thoughts on this character, guys. What do you think of the character of Toshiro Hitsugaya? Let me know in the comments below. What's your favourite Hitsugaya moment? What's your favourite Hitsugaya fight? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to hit subscribe if you haven't done already, guys, and until next time, I'll catch you later. I'll see you then.